As Allied troops began to occupy Germany in the final months of World War II, the brutal realities of one of the world's greatest atrocities started to become clear to the world. Through the stories of survivors who were liberated from German concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, depicted on the screen, and the discoveries that Allied soldiers made while liberating the camps, the realities of the Holocaust and the German treatment of Jews and other prisoners during World War II started to become clear to the world. Above the gates to the entrance of Auschwitz is this phrase Arbeit macht frei, which when translated from German means work will set you free. This was the message that German soldiers gave to the prisoners entering the concentration camp. However, the reality was far worse. Once in concentration camps, German prisoners would be systematically executed or worked to death as they were forced to live in some of the most brutal and inhumane conditions imaginable. In total, roughly 12 million people would lose their lives as a result of the Holocaust, including 6 million European Jews, as Hitler attempted to cleanse Europe of its Jewish population. The origins of the Holocaust begin with the Nazi plan to eliminate vermin from Germany upon their rise to power in the early 1930s. The Nazis believed that certain groups of people within Germany's population were naturally inferior to others. Nazis believed that the Aryan race was the most superior race in Europe and that they should dominate life throughout Germany and the rest of Europe. This led Nazis to attempt to eliminate various groups of people who they viewed as either inferior, defective, or undesirable. Nazis targeted Jews and gypsies who were nomads and performers who roamed throughout Europe making a living, as well as people of Polish descent, people of Afro-European descent, and other biracial Europeans as inferior races of people. The Nazis also targeted people who they considered defective. This included people who had mental or physical disabilities, as well as people who were drug and alcohol addicts, homosexuals, and orphan children. In many cases, these defective populations were either euthanized and put to death, or sterilized so that they could not reproduce offspring to further populate Germany. The last group of people who were targeted by this Nazi campaign to eliminate the vermin within Germany were Germans who were considered undesirable. This included people who believed in the ideas of communism, which was spreading throughout the Soviet Union, as well as criminals, prostitutes, homeless Germans, artists, and political opponents who attempted to resist the ideas of Hitler and the Nazi Party. As the Nazis became more and more powerful within Germany, they began targeting German Jews and blaming them for the problems that Germany had suffered during the Great Depression. This led to a series of events where Jews in Germany were discriminated against and persecuted. The first of these events was the passing of the Nuremberg racial laws in 1935. These laws severely restricted the rights of Jewish people in Germany by denying them German citizenship. Once their citizenship was denied, Jews were unable to access German schools and universities. They were often denied the right to pursue certain jobs within Germany, and they lost the right to marry anyone who was not Jewish. This forced marriage of Jews was designed to limit the procreation and growth of the Jewish population in Germany. In 1938, the Nazis began to physically attack Jews through the events of Kristallnacht. On this evening, which became known as the Night of Broken Glass, violent attacks occurred throughout Germany where Jewish synagogues and businesses were vandalized and burned to the ground. Following Kristallnacht, Jews in Germany had their property seized from them, and they were forced to move into rundown areas of German cities known as ghettos, where they often lived without basic necessities and utilities, including water, electricity, and sewage. Jews who were allowed to remain in German cities and who were not forced into ghettos had to carry ID cards and were forced to wear Stars of David badges on their clothing to be identified as second-class citizens in Germany. As World War II began and Hitler began to occupy the territories of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and other areas of Eastern Europe, Jews began to be moved into concentration camps where they were to be held while Hitler considered possible deportation sites so that they could be sent outside of Germany's borders. While planning for the deportation of the Jewish Germans, Hitler began to develop what became known as his final solution, or his solution to the Jewish problem. Under this plan, the Nazi Schutzstaffel, or SS soldiers, were assigned the task of systematically exterminating Jewish prisoners in concentration camps. These actions amounted to a genocide where people were attacked and murdered because of their race, ethnicity, or religion. As this plan went into effect, concentration camps were set up throughout German-controlled territory, as depicted on the map to the right. At each one of these red dots, a concentration camp was set up to house German Jews and other prisoners who were put into the camps. Prisoners in concentration camps arrived by train under some incredibly harsh conditions. Upon arriving at the camps, any prisoners who were too weak to work, who were sick, who were pregnant, or who were elderly were immediately exterminated through gas chambers and crematoriums. Young and healthy Jews and other prisoners were tattooed with an ID number to identify them as a prisoner of a concentration camp, and were put to work supporting the German war effort, where they would ultimately be worked to death. In concentration camps, German prisoners were put to work digging mass graves for the bodies of the other prisoners who had been executed. They were forced to dig latrines and sewage systems to dispose of human waste, as well as build crematoriums where many of the bodies of the victims of the Holocaust would be burned and cremated. Other prisoners were forced to work in areas that were designed to promote the German war effort, such as mining for stone and other resources that Germany would use to support its army, as well as making shoes, clothes, and uniforms for German citizens and soldiers. While being worked to death, prisoners in concentration camps were often malnourished, forced to live in conditions of incredibly poor hygiene and sanitation, and were experimented on by Nazi scientists who were conducting medical experiments for the purposes of sterilization, euthanization, and the use of chemical weapons in World War II. The three most significant concentration camps of the Holocaust were Dachau, which is located in southern Germany near the city of Munich, identified by camp number 6 on the map. Dachau was the first concentration camp built in Germany, and this was the first concentration camp liberated by U.S. soldiers in 1945, as we began to expose the realities of the Holocaust and what Germany had done throughout the course of World War II. Auschwitz, which is designated as camp number 1 on the map, is located right on the border of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. Auschwitz was liberated by Russian troops who were advancing from the Eastern Front, and upon the liberation of Auschwitz, the Russians discovered the true horror of the Holocaust, as Auschwitz was the model concentration camp used for exterminating the Jews during the Holocaust. At Auschwitz, over 1.3 million people were imprisoned, and over 1.1 million people were executed, most of them being Jews who had been captured in either Germany or Poland. The third major concentration camp was the Buchenwald concentration camp, which is designated as camp number 4 here in central Germany. Buchenwald was one of the most physically demanding concentration camps, where prisoners were put to work mining stone and doing hard labor at other mining sites near the camp, gathering resources for the German war effort. The images on this slide are just a few of the horrors of the Holocaust that were discovered upon arriving at the concentration camps. The work that prisoners were forced to do was often backbreaking and dangerous to their health. Prisoners who were lucky enough to survive the camps and be freed by the Allied armies, as seen in the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, were often emaciated, malnourished, and in failing health. Many of the prisoners who were freed from the camps at the end of the war ultimately died because of the health problems and complications of their treatment while in the camp. Hundreds of thousands of children were also imprisoned in concentration camps, and upon arriving at the camps, groups of dead bodies who had been from prisoners who had been executed or gassed to death, as well as massive piles of ashes and bone from prisoners who had been burned alive in crematoriums or whose bodies had been burned as an attempt to get rid of the evidence and make room for future prisoners in concentration camps were discovered. The true realities of the Holocaust and World War II would not be known until many years after the war. But what we've learned is that through the events of World War II, roughly 70 million people lost their lives. 3/4 of them were members of the Allied nations. 27% of those were Allied soldiers, while almost 50% of the total deaths in World War II were Allied civilians. Of that 70 million, roughly 60 million people were soldiers and civilians who were killed during the events of World War II. Russia and China accounted for 2 of the largest death tolls as a result of the events that occurred in their countries. The Soviet Union suffered over 25 million deaths through the events of World War II. While many of these were on the battlefield or the result of the German attacks on the Eastern Front, over 15 million were Russian citizens who were worked to death or killed by the leader of Russia, Joseph Stalin, during the events of collectivization, the purges of his political enemies, and the forced labor of Russians in Russian prison camps known as gulags. What Stalin was doing to his people was very similar to what Hitler was doing to the Jews and his political enemies in Germany. However, Stalin used propaganda to cover up a lot of the things that he was doing, and so these events were not known until after Stalin's death in 1953. China suffered over 15 million casualties, most of them a result of the treatment of Chinese prisoners and the attacks on Manchuria and other areas of China leading up to and during World War II by Japan. Germany would suffer 7 million deaths, many of them German Jews who were imprisoned in concentration camps and executed, and Poland would suffer 6 million deaths. Again, many of them being Jews who were captured and put into concentration camps, or Poles who were killed during the German occupation of Poland in 1939. The United States would suffer a relatively small number of casualties, totaling out at approximately 419,000 soldiers who were killed. In addition to the 60 million soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 12 million people were systematically murdered during the Holocaust. This included 6 million Jews, who accounted for roughly 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe, as well as 5 million POWs, other political prisoners arrested by the Nazis, or other undesirable Germans who had been put into concentration camps. This included approximately 3.3 million Russian POWs who were held by Germany in concentration camps on the Eastern Front. These numbers are estimates because in many instances, Germans did not keep accurate records of the prisoners that they executed upon arrival to the camps, and towards the end of the war, many of the records of prisoners of concentration camps were destroyed by Germany soldiers in an attempt to cover up the atrocities of the Holocaust. The true realities of the Holocaust were not known until the end of the Nuremberg trials, which occurred from 1945 to 1949. Through these trials, the details and evidence of the Holocaust was publicly presented to the world. As Axis military leaders, doctors, and political leaders were put on trial and convicted of the war crimes that they had committed, both fighting in World War II and through the genocide of the Holocaust. Many of the leaders who were put on trial were ultimately sentenced to lengthy prison sentences or death for their actions during World War II and the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials also set a precedent for the trial of Japanese military and political leaders following the conclusion of World War II, as well as future incidents of war crimes and genocide that would occur throughout the Cold War era from 1950 through 1990.